This is House Planning Help, episode 58. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-building or renovating. I'm looking into what houses we should be building in the 21st century, my own personal goal to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. And coming up in this episode, my guest is Chris Parsons from Parsons Whittley Architects. We're going to be looking at whether it costs more to build a passive house. So how are you doing? Hope you're okay, and I'm feeling particularly good because I'm nice and relaxed after a break in Italy. It was actually to mark our 5th wedding anniversary because we did get married over there in this beautiful, well, quite small castle. A lovely area. It's always good that you can fill out the place without having to have 500 guests. This very boutique castle. What I noticed though, and the reason that I'm telling you about this now, is that they'd installed air conditioning since the last visit that we made there. No doubts people complaining when in that really hot period of the summer, because I don't think it's all year round. So I wondered, well, is this necessary? Will I need to use this during my stay? Because obviously they've gone from a situation of not having any energy that they need to cool the building in the summer to now using energy. They have these shutters that really do block out all of the light. And that's the issue because the nighttime temperature is really cool. So you could leave the windows wide open. Well, perhaps you get the bugs in, but they did have a screen over there. And then it cools nicely. But of course, you're going to get woken up by the sun. And then the flip side, which I was quite disappointed by because I thought, well, if I make sure the room is really cool before I go to sleep and then close all those shutters, because of the high ceilings, there is no way it's going to get hot in here. Well, I was completely wrong on that. So it was just a weird situation of thinking, how could we do that you wouldn't need to install all these air conditioning units? Anyway, I like to share a little story or two as they come up and my mind gets thinking on those things. Let's get to today's interview, and it's with Chris Parsons from Parsons Whittley. I've seen him give a number of presentations, including one recently for Encraft, their Passivhaus conference, also the Chartered Institute of Builders, and I'm always impressed that he manages to find time because I know he's busy and I've tried a number of times to organise this interview. I know that our schedules haven't quite matched up. Luckily, though, he's been nominated for one of the UK Passivhaus Awards this year. That's where I bumped into him last year as well. So we're going to talk about that scheme a little bit. Also, the costs of Passivhaus. It's a question that I imagine you've thought of. Well, it's going to cost more to build a Passivhaus. Well, if it does, how much more? And is it sliding scale? And what does it depend on? So we're going to get into all of that. However, I started by asking him for a bit of background and how he became interested in sustainable architecture.
I think really the practice has always been interested in making sure that we build the most efficient buildings, and obviously with the issues around global warming, we're looking at carbon emissions, and we combine both of those, I suppose, which is probably what led us towards the Passivhaus solution, because it seems to address both of those issues.
You've had a number of Passivhaus schemes that have gone on site, and I'm sure those examples will come up. But in terms of costing, where do you start? Are you always expecting it's going to cost more to build a Passivhaus? I
think probably I'm going to introduce a couple of quick qualifications, if I may, because one thing that's important to remember is that Passivhaus, the house being the German word for building, means that you can deliver Passivhaus both in domestic houses in the English sense, but also in any other building. And the reason that I introduced that qualification is because the larger the building, the more efficient form factor you have, the less impact there is on cost. So we can deliver medium to large size buildings probably with not much impact on cost. But in terms of the projects we've delivered, which have generally been domestic dwellings in the social housing arena, where they are quite small, there is always an impact on cost.
Have you found that since your first scheme, the costs have come down? What was it that might first send you over?
We have found that we've changed the cost, sometimes down, sometimes upwards, so that's not helpful. And actually, I'm going to correct myself there. We've changed the price we pay because it's not quite the same as the cost. The reason that I make that distinction is that it largely depends on how you procure your work as to how much information you have about what the actual cost of a Passivhaus is. The things that obviously make a difference. So when you sit down and sensibly analyse why should this cost more, we're putting in more insulation, we're using more expensive windows and doors, and we are going to use a mechanical ventilation system with heat recovery. On the negative side, we probably will have a slightly simpler mechanical infrastructure in the house because we don't need quite so much traditional heating. So those three factors definitely add cost. And then there are elements, I think, around the quality of the workmanship, which I always have some doubt about arguing that increases cost because we should be having that level of quality in all of our buildings. But in truth, we don't get that in all of our buildings. So there is an additional cost in delivering the quality necessary for Passivhaus. And then there is the requirement to address airtightness. And again, some of those products, not horrendously expensive in the scheme of things, but you can't argue anything other than they will add a little bit more cost.
Even if this does cost more, are we getting more for our money?
We're definitely getting more for our money. As I mentioned earlier about the quality of the workmanship, for example, that shouldn't be an extra cost. In strict accounting terms, I don't think that should be an extra cost for Passivhaus because we really ought to be pushing the standards in our ordinary building. And I suppose to some degree we're beginning to see the building regs trying to catch up, and I think they're making great strides in trying to bring the differential between Passivhaus and standard construction. They're trying to reduce that differential. Because we're getting a better quality building, we will definitely be getting a building that will use less energy. And particularly in the area that I work in terms of delivering social housing, addressing fuel poverty is a big driver for us doing Passivhaus because we really need to address fuel poverty. We all know that fuel is only going one way, and of course in terms of price, and so everything we can do to use less is very sensible. I think as well, reducing the amount of fuel that we use reduces the amount of carbon emissions, so that's a benefit for society as a whole. But there's also benefits, I think, for the long-term maintenance of the buildings because we've built to a better quality and we've used better components. We're getting a building that will cost less to maintain. And the final point I think that you ought to add into the mix is that we're probably delivering a more comfortable and more healthy environment for the occupants. And that shouldn't be overlooked. We like to think that we ventilate our buildings fine at the moment, but actually there's some evidence to show that we're underventilating nearly all of our buildings. So actually something which positively addresses air quality is another plus.
Listening to all of those points that you brought up, they were all benefits for the occupants. Now, I would like to think that if ever I come to build something, you want to build something good for the occupant, but there are no incentives there for the company who might be doing this and interested in the money. Is that always going to be a barrier to wide-scale Passivhaus adoption?
I think there is the potential for that to always be an issue because particularly in the UK, with the way we have organised our housing market, the capital cost is divorced from the running cost. And as a consequence, it does get quite difficult to justify to your house builder, for example, that he ought to be building to the Passivhaus standard. So I think we need to move the thing forward through legislation. And I mentioned earlier about raising the ordinary standard, the building regulation standards, and that will help to reduce that differential. So that might start to encourage people to consider the additional expense. I think, again, just referring to the social housing arena, my clients have noticed that they have fewer rent arrears and they have fewer void properties in their Passivhaus schemes. Too early to say hand on heart that's definitely because they're Passivhaus, but I think our belief is that by providing people with a really comfortable environment that doesn't cost them very much to run, they don't really want to live in anything else.
In terms of cost, this might be a good point to bring in some of the example projects that you have worked on. The very first one, is that the one that cost more percentage-wise? Has it worked like that? Or is there a very static percentage that you think it's costing above a traditionally built house?
That's an interesting question, Ben. The very first Passivhaus scheme we were involved in was the Wimbish Passivhaus scheme, 14 dwellings down in Essex. And it was interesting because the construction industry hadn't really delivered Passivhaus in that multi-unit arena before. and as a consequence, procurement became quite a challenge. We worked hard to try to find contractors who were interested in delivering Passivhaus, and we then narrowed that down and eventually placed a contract with somebody, Keepmoat actually, and we did a cost exercise against another 14-unit Code 4 scheme, and the difference was about 12%, so we paid about a 12% premium on the very first scheme. We then negotiated the second Passivhaus scheme that we did, the Ditchingham Passive Houses, with the same contractor. But it was at a time when the housing market wasn't particularly buoyant, and I was a witness to the negotiating techniques, and we managed to secure that for a 6% increase. So that would indicate a downward trend, which we were quite happy with. However, I think during the course of the project we realised that maybe that was more to do with negotiation than actual cost. And my more recent schemes have generally been shown to be around the 12 to 15% uplift again. So I think if I was to have to draw a conclusion, I would say at the moment we are paying around about 15% more for a Passivhaus scheme over and above the standard we would otherwise deliver.
Will that change from company to company? Is that just how you were constructing?
It will change. As I mentioned right at the start, there's an issue around form factor. So remember, I'm talking about small houses which do push the boundary in terms of what we need to do with the fabric. It will also change, I think, depending upon exactly how you procure the work, because remember, I'm always talking about price when I mention those figures and not cost. So I'm talking about what we have paid a contractor to do that work.
Can you explain that a bit more? Sorry, I just price and cost. I was thinking, hold on, what?
Okay. Well, the construction industry is an interesting place to work for a number of reasons. But the issue is that all of our schemes have been procured using a design and build process. And what that means is that we've designed up to a planning stage for those buildings, but we haven't put any detail as to how we're going to achieve the standard at the time at which they obtain the build price. So a contractor will have come in, looked at my planning drawings and sucked his thumb to some degree and said, how much will I want to deliver that to a Passivhaus standard? In the early days, of course, he will have done that without any knowledge as to how to deliver to the Passivhaus standard because there's not enough experience out there. So I suppose what I'm saying is the difference really between cost and price is largely a contractor's risk premium. He will have looked at that project and thought, I think I can do Passivhaus for X, but there's a risk here, so I want X plus Y. And I'm only talking about the result of X plus Y because I don't have enough information to get down to the X figure.
I know that we have discussed this risk factor is what ends up pushing up the price. So is that something eventually we can take out of the equation?
I think there are ways that we could possibly take it out of the equation. Again, it's about everybody's attitude to risk because there is always risk in a building project, and so it's really down to who's prepared to take that risk. If your client, for example, is prepared to take the risk, then he can take the risk premium out of the contract because now the contractor has no risk and you simply pay him for what he does. Of course, if the risk occurs, then your client will have to pay that cost. So we can take the risk premium out, providing the client himself is prepared to take that risk.
In one of our episodes, we talked about eco-minimalism, this concept that you can create a passive house by working backwards almost and starting with the essential building blocks that you'll need. You know that you're going to need the insulation and the triple glazed windows, etc., the ventilation, and then creating a building with the rest of that money. Is that a way to get closer to things costing like for like?
Yeah, I think the essential principle probably that you're referring to there is absolutely starting with keeping it simple. I think if we keep everything as simple as we can, then we should end up with a cost-effective passive house. I think there is a tendency to overcomplicate what we try and do, not just in Passivhaus actually, in some of our Code for Sustainable Homes houses. They've been quite complex in trying to tick various boxes. But I think what I like most about Passivhaus is that it does just come down to a set of numbers at the end of the day. So as a designer, you can start with a pencil sketch, run it through the software, make sure that you are somewhere near those numbers, and then continue to develop the scheme. And every time we've done that, simplicity has been the easiest way to achieve the target.
For you and I, simplicity is a given and sensible, but is that going to appeal to the mass market?
Yes, don't confuse my use of the word simplicity with boring. I think that, I suppose what I'm talking about is just not getting carried away with the intricacies of how to put a building together. So I'm talking about simplicity in terms of detailing. I'm talking about simplicity in terms of how you use the space. To some degree, we probably don't want to add on too many visual adornments, if you like, because they have a tendency to introduce thermal bridging. But I don't think that necessarily needs to mean that the buildings are unattractive. And I think one of the things that we have done as a practice is to try to develop Passivhaus in a more normal, if you like, more English tradition, more traditional vernacular, I suppose. And I think that we've been reasonably successful in doing that. We've done a number of Passivhaus schemes in conservation areas and areas of outstanding natural beauty, etc., and even won awards from planners for them. So, I think you can still make them very attractive, but keep them simple in terms of the philosophy.
Do you foresee a time that a Passivhaus standard house will be worth more? It's difficult at this stage because there haven't been that many built, but then that would add an extra incentive for going the full distance and paying that extra.
Yeah, I think I do see some movement towards a greater demand for Passivhaus, or for low energy buildings, or for low running cost buildings. We work, as well as Passivhaus work, we work for a number of developers. We work just generally in the construction industry. And just in our own experience of clients walking through the door looking for a building, there's definitely a greater awareness that we can deliver very low energy buildings, and therefore I'm being asked for them. And I think it's that demand which will probably provide the answer to your question. We have to make sure that people ask for the product and recognise the value of it. And at that point, I think we will get to the stage where you can start to charge a premium for being able to deliver that extra performance. Certainly, my understanding is that that's the case in Europe, where people talk about a 3 to 5% premium for the delivery of Passivhaus. And I think the key to it, however, will be certification. I think if I was going to pay some extra money for a Passivhaus, I'd want to be sure that it was one. So I'd like to see certification adopted as a means of quality control and a means of quality assurance, I suppose. But yeah, I think the public actually is more aware than the media and the house building industry currently understands.
Are there any other aspects of cost that we should bring in to round off this conversation?
I think simplicity again. Simplicity of detailing will help to reduce the cost. Simplicity of the mechanical services all help to reduce the cost. Because, as I mentioned right at the start, we've got these factors, the insulation, the windows, things like that, which are more expensive than in our normal housing. So I think we need to counter that with being sensible about how we use them, where we put them, understand their contribution to the performance, and therefore, I suppose what I'm coming down to is the skill of the designer can actually help to reduce the cost of delivering Passivhaus by absolutely understanding what the sensitivities are, not over-egging the omelette, using exactly what's necessary to deliver the performance standards. So I think probably, get yourself a good architect.
Well, just before we conclude, I know that I've seen a couple of your presentations and you've often had some interesting occupant feedback. So maybe that's where we can finish up looking at some of your schemes and just going through some of this.
Okay. It's been very interesting, I think. Wimbish in particular was our first scheme, as I mentioned, and we were lucky enough to get some money from Technology Strategy Board to carry out some post-occupation evaluation. And as well as that, my clients, Hasto Housing, organised a monthly seminar on site where we would introduce Passivhaus to other architects and other housing associations. So we've had the opportunity to meet the tenants there on a frequent basis every month or so. And they've given us some tremendous feedback. I think one of the ones that sticks in my mind is the young lady who in her first year, or first few months there, had been putting away the same amount of money as she had in her previous home, and said to us, "This is tremendous. If this carries on like this, my children will be able to have some Christmas presents." And a little tear appeared in the corner of my eye. And then she said, "And if it really carries on like this, we'll be able to have a holiday next year." So that's very heartwarming, I think, when you hear that. But and indeed, that proved to be the case. So that we had a lady on BBC television confirmed that her gas bill is £120 for the year. So that's good. But I think as well, one of the same lady said to me that she had been for a fortnight's holiday to stay with her mother and really decided that she never wanted to live in anything other than a passive house ever again. So we know we're delivering good quality buildings, we know we're delivering comfortable buildings, and we're delivering buildings that are cheap to run. So that kind of confirms that we're doing what we set out to do.
Well, Chris, it's been great to have a chat. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
You can see pictures from the 3 Passivhaus schemes we've been talking about today, Wimbish, Ditchingham and Burnham Overy Staithe, in today's show notes, along with the key points from the session, and we got links across to Chris and Parsons and Whitley. houseplanninghelp.com/58. We also have a question for you in the show notes. How much more would you be prepared to pay for a passive house, and why? That's what I would like to know. Even if you've been through the experience, perhaps you've totted up how much more you might have paid. It'd be really interesting if you could leave that comment at the bottom of the show notes, or anything else that you might like to ask Chris, and we'll see if we can bring him back. houseplanninghelp.com/58. Let's finish up on a couple of iTunes reviews. Thank you very much for these. They're all so kind. This one in from Wind Engineer, who's based in the UK. The title is, "This podcast is making long journeys great. The content is great, the quality is great, the guests are great. Generally, it's hard to find any flaws. I highly recommend this for anyone who even has the slightest interest in building a home or an extension." Also, Vertru is in the UK, informative and thought-provoking, highlighting solutions available now. These podcasts drip feed topics to form a comprehensive knowledge base. I have been particularly keen to hear on build aspects that will leave a home cheap to run. So if you leave an iTunes review, not only is it great feedback for us here and what you like and to kind of motivate us forwards, but it helps other people find this podcast, and the listenership has been going up and up and up, which is exactly what we want, to try and proliferate this content as much as possible. So if you could leave us a review the next time you're on iTunes, that would be brilliant. And talking of next time, Andrew Farr from the Green Building Store is my guest as we look at the qualities an MVHR system should bring to a house. Until then, take care.